August 17th, 1963. The turquoise waters off Miami Beach shimmered under the late afternoon sun, and Danny Prescott sat in his elevated lifeguard chair, scanning the swimmers below with practiced eyes. For most people, this stretch of sand represented nothing more than vacation paradise. They believed the greatest dangers came from riptides and jellyfish, never suspecting that their oceanfront playground had become ground zero for one of the Cold War's most dangerous games. What Danny would discover in the next 48 hours would shatter that illusion completely, revealing how a seemingly innocent tourist with a camera was actually documenting America's most sensitive military installations, and how one observant lifeguard would become an unlikely hero in the shadow war between superpowers. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Danny Prescott had grown up on these beaches, the son of a World War II veteran who had fought in the Pacific. At 26 years old, with sun-bleached hair and the kind of tan that only comes from spending 12 months a year outdoors, Danny embodied everything people imagined when they thought of a Miami Beach lifeguard. But beneath that casual exterior lay something his fellow lifeguards didn't possess: an acute attention to detail honed by 4 years in the United States Navy, where he had served on a destroyer conducting anti-submarine patrols off the coast of Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis the previous October had scared him more than he cared to admit. Knowing that Soviet nuclear weapons sat just 90 miles from his hometown had fundamentally changed how he viewed the world. When his enlistment ended in March of 1963, Danny had returned to Miami Beach, grateful to be home, but unable to shake the vigilance the Navy had instilled in him. He noticed things others missed: patterns, anomalies, threats. The afternoon started like any other. Danny had begun his shift at 2 o'clock, taking over from Jerry Martinez, who complained about sunburn and a group of teenagers who kept swimming past the safety buoys. The beach was moderately crowded for a Saturday in August. Families clustered under striped umbrellas. Couples walked hand in hand along the waterline. A group of college students tossed a football in the shallow surf. Everything appeared normal, peaceful, exactly as a beach should be. Danny settled into his chair, a whistle around his neck and binoculars within easy reach. He mentally divided his section of beach into zones, systematically scanning each one every few minutes. This methodical approach had saved 3 lives in the past 4 months. A child caught in a rip current, a man suffering a heart attack, a woman stung by a Portuguese man-of-war who went into anaphylactic shock. His co-workers joked that Danny took the job too seriously, but he couldn't help himself. Some people were wired differently. At approximately 3:15, Danny noticed a man who didn't fit. The individual was perhaps 40 years old, stocky build, with pale skin that suggested he'd arrived in Miami recently. He wore dark slacks and a short-sleeved white shirt, completely inappropriate for the beach. Most tourists wore swimsuits or at least shorts. This man looked like he had just stepped out of an office. He carried a leather camera bag slung over one shoulder and walked with purpose, not the aimless stroll of a beachgoer enjoying the scenery. Danny watched as the man stopped approximately 200 feet north of the lifeguard stand, removed a camera from his bag, and began photographing the ocean. Nothing inherently suspicious about that. Thousands of tourists photographed Miami Beach every day. But something about the man's behavior triggered Danny's instincts. The photographer wasn't composing artistic shots or capturing memories. He worked systematically, methodically, like someone conducting a survey. He would aim the camera at a specific angle, take several shots, move 15 feet, and repeat the process. Danny picked up his binoculars and focused on the man. The camera was impressive, far more sophisticated than the Kodak Instamatics most tourists carried. It had a large telephoto lens, the kind professional photographers or serious hobbyists used. The man took approximately 20 photographs over the course of 10 minutes, all aimed at the ocean or the northern stretch of coastline. Then he packed the camera away, consulted what appeared to be a small notebook, and walked back toward Collins Avenue, the main street running parallel to the beach. Strange, but not necessarily sinister. Danny made a mental note and returned his attention to the swimmers. A woman was struggling against the current about 75 yards out. He blew his whistle. signaling her to swim parallel to the shore rather than fighting directly against the pull. She followed his instructions and soon reached calmer water. Crisis averted. The photographer returned 45 minutes later. This time he positioned himself even closer to Danny's stand, perhaps 100 feet away. He removed the same camera and resumed his systematic documentation, but now he aimed the lens north toward the luxury hotels lining Collins Avenue. Danny watched through his binoculars, trying to determine what the man found so fascinating. The hotels? The street? The traffic pattern? Then the photographer did something that sent a chill down Danny's spine. He aimed his camera directly at Haulover Beach, approximately 3 miles north, where the United States Coast Guard operated a small facility. Danny knew that facility housed radar equipment used to monitor boat traffic and aircraft in the area. He had learned about it during his Navy service. It wasn't classified exactly, but it wasn't advertised either. The man couldn't possibly photograph the facility clearly from this distance, even with a telephoto lens, but he was certainly trying. Danny's mind raced through possibilities. Maybe the man was an amateur photographer with an interest in military installations. Maybe he worked for a newspaper or magazine doing a story on coastal defenses. Maybe he was just eccentric, or maybe he was something far more dangerous. Miami had become a hotbed of espionage activity over the past few years. Everyone knew the CIA operated a massive covert station somewhere in the city, running operations against Castro's Cuba. What fewer people discussed was that Soviet intelligence had responded in kind, deploying agents throughout South Florida to monitor American activities. The FBI had briefed Danny and other former military personnel about this when he left the Navy, warning them to report suspicious activity. At the time, Danny had thought the briefing paranoid, a relic of McCarthy-era hysteria. Now he reconsidered. The photographer spent another 15 minutes documenting the northern coastline, then walked away. Danny noted the time, 4:37. He also noted the man's appearance in more detail, 5 feet 8 inches tall approximately, weight around 175 pounds, dark hair, receding hairline, glasses with thick black frames, no visible identifying marks or tattoos. The man walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg. He carried the camera bag on his right shoulder. These were the kinds of details the Navy had trained Danny to observe and remember. He debated whether to report this to someone. But who? The police would think he was crazy. A man taking photographs on a public beach wasn't a crime. Danny had no evidence of wrongdoing, only instinct and suspicion. He decided to wait and see if the photographer returned. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The beach crowd thinned as families packed up their belongings and headed to dinner. Danny's shift ended at 6 o'clock, but he stayed an extra 30 minutes scanning the beach for the photographer. The man didn't return. Danny finally climbed down from his chair, his legs stiff from hours of sitting. He locked the first aid kit and radio in the storage shed, then headed to his apartment 3 blocks from the beach. All evening he couldn't stop thinking about the photographer. Something was wrong. He felt it in his gut, the same intuition that had warned him about approaching storms at sea or mechanical problems on the destroyer. His instincts had kept him alive in the Navy. He had learned to trust them. The next morning, Sunday, Danny arrived at his post at 9 o'clock, taking over the early shift. The beach was quieter on Sunday mornings. Most tourists slept late after Saturday night festivities. Local families attended church. Danny had the sand almost to himself for the first hour. He used the time to review what he had observed the previous day, mentally cataloguing every detail about the photographer. At 10:23, the man returned. Danny spotted him immediately, walking north along the beach from the direction of the public parking lot on 21st Street. Same dark slacks, same white shirt, same camera bag. The man set up his operation approximately 300 feet north of Danny's position and began his systematic photography. This time, however, his attention focused south, toward Miami Beach's downtown area and the causeways connecting the beach to the mainland. Danny watched through binoculars, his heart rate accelerating. The photographer was documenting infrastructure, roads, bridges, hotels, public buildings. Why would anyone need such detailed photographic documentation of Miami Beach's layout unless they were planning something? Danny made a decision. He climbed down from his chair and approached Jerry Martinez, who was working the adjacent section of beach. Jerry was reading a magazine, barely watching the three people in the water. Danny said, "Watch my section for a few minutes. I need to make a phone call." Jerry looked up, annoyed at being interrupted, but agreed. The nearest public phone was at the beach pavilion, 2 blocks south. Danny jogged there, fishing coins from his pocket. He had memorized the FBI field office number after the Navy briefing. The phone rang 4 times before someone answered. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Miami Field Office. "How may I direct your call?" Danny said. "I need to report suspicious activity, possible espionage." There was a pause. The operator said, "Please hold for the duty agent." 2 minutes passed. 3. Danny watched the beach, worried he was wasting time on a fool's errand. Then a male voice came on the line. "This is Special Agent Robert Carmichael. How can I help you?" Danny explained who he was, his Navy background, and what he had observed over the past 18 hours. He expected skepticism or dismissal. Instead, Agent Carmichael listened intently, asking detailed questions. What kind of camera? What specific locations did he photograph? Did you observe any associates or contacts? How did he arrive and depart? Danny answered everything as precisely as he could. When he finished, Carmichael said, "You did the right thing calling us. Stay where you are. We will send agents to your location within 30 minutes. In the meantime, maintain visual contact with the subject if possible, but do not approach or confront him. Do you understand?" Danny said he understood. Carmichael said, "What is your current location?" Danny provided the address of the beach pavilion. Carmichael said, "Wait there. An agent will meet you shortly." Danny hung up and ran back to his lifeguard stand. Jerry said, "Everything okay?" Danny said, "Yeah, just had to handle something." He climbed back into his chair and immediately located the photographer, who had moved another 100 yards south and now stood almost directly in front of Danny's position. The man was photographing the hotels on Collins Avenue, specifically the Fontainebleau and the Eden Rock, 2 of Miami Beach's most famous luxury establishments. Danny knew that wealthy Americans, foreign dignitaries, and even some government officials stayed at those hotels. If Soviet intelligence wanted to monitor who was visiting Miami Beach, those hotels would be prime targets for surveillance. The photographer worked for another 10 minutes, then checked his watch, packed his camera, and walked toward Collins Avenue. Danny watched him cross the street and enter a white sedan parked near the corner of 46th Street. The car pulled into traffic and disappeared, heading south. 22 minutes later, 2 men in dark suits approached Danny's lifeguard stand. The older one, perhaps 50 years old with gray hair and a weathered face, said, "Danny Prescott?" Danny climbed down and said, "Yes, that is me." The man showed a badge and identification card. "Special Agent Robert Carmichael, FBI. This is Special Agent Thomas Chen. Can you walk us through what you observed?" Danny described everything again, this time with even more detail. The agents listened without interrupting, Chen taking notes in a small leather notebook. When Danny finished, Carmichael said, "Did you notice the vehicle he left in?" Danny said, "White sedan, looked like a Chevrolet, maybe a 1960 or 61 model. I could not see the license plate from this distance." Carmichael and Chen exchanged glances. Carmichael said, "This individual matches the description of someone we have been monitoring. We believe he is a Soviet intelligence officer operating under cover as a tourist. The photographs he is taking are likely reconnaissance for future operations." Danny felt vindication mixed with alarm. He said, "What kind of operations?" Carmichael said, "We cannot share operational details, but your observations have been extremely valuable. We need your continued assistance. If this individual returns, we need you to contact us immediately." He handed Danny a business card with a phone number handwritten on the back. Carmichael said, "Call this number any time, day or night. Someone will always answer. If he returns today, call us while he is still here. We will have surveillance teams in the area within minutes." Danny said, "You want me to just watch him and call you?" Carmichael said, "Exactly. Do not approach him. Do not let him know you are observing him. Act completely normal. Can you do that?" Danny said he could. Chen said, "Did he do anything else unusual? Any meetings with other individuals? Any exchanges of materials?" Danny said, No, he was always alone. He just photographs and leaves. Carmichael nodded and said, "Good, keep watching. You may have stumbled onto something significant." The agents left, and Danny returned to his chair, scanning the beach with new urgency. The photographer didn't return that afternoon, but Danny remained vigilant, watching every person who came near his section of beach. His mind churned with questions. Who was this man? What was he planning? How many other Soviet agents operated in Miami Beach? The thought that enemy spies walked freely through his neighborhood, documenting potential targets, disturbed him deeply. This was America, not East Berlin. People came here to relax, to escape their problems, not to be surveilled by hostile foreign powers. As the sun set on Sunday evening, Danny felt exhausted, not from physical labor but from mental strain. He had spent 9 hours in a state of hypervigilance, analyzing every person, every movement, every anomaly. When his replacement arrived at 6 o'clock, Danny briefed him without mentioning the photographer or the FBI. No point in starting rumors or creating panic. Monday morning arrived with typical South Florida weather, hot, humid, with thunderstorms forecast for the afternoon. Danny began his shift at 10 o'clock, later than usual because Jerry owed him coverage from the weekend. The beach was moderately crowded, mostly retirees who came early to avoid the midday heat. Danny scanned the usual suspects: the elderly couple who swam every day at 10:30, the jogger who ran barefoot along the waterline, the teenager who practiced surfing despite Miami Beach's generally calm waves. Everything normal. At 11:17, the photographer returned. Danny spotted him walking south along the beach, camera bag over his shoulder, same dark clothes. But this time, he wasn't alone. A second man walked beside him, younger, perhaps 30, with blonde hair and the athletic build. They stopped approximately 250 feet north of Danny's position and conversed for several minutes, the older man pointing at various landmarks, while the younger man nodded and occasionally wrote in a small notebook. Danny grabbed his radio and called the beach patrol supervisor. He said, "I need to take a break. Urgent personal matter." The supervisor, a retired firefighter named Phil Dawson, said, "Everything okay?" Danny said, "Yes, just need to make a quick phone call." Phil said, "Go ahead. I will cover your section." Danny climbed down and ran to the pavilion phone. He dialed the number Carmichael had given him. A woman answered on the first ring. She said, "Yes?" Danny said, "This is Danny Prescott." The subject returned, and he has another individual with him. The woman said, "Stay on the line." 15 seconds later, Carmichael came on. He said, "Where are you?" Danny said, "Beach pavilion phone, same as yesterday. They are approximately 200 yards north of my Lifeguard stand." Carmichael said, "Describe the second individual." Danny provided the description. Carmichael said, "Do not lose sight of them. We have units responding. Stay at your post and observe." Danny ran back to his chair, arriving just as Phil was radioing him. Phil said, "Do you have someone drowning or what?" Danny said, "No, false alarm, all good." He climbed into his chair and focused his binoculars on the two men. They had separated. The older photographer was taking pictures of the coastline while the younger man walked toward Collins Avenue. Danny watched the younger man reach the street, where he stood on the corner as if waiting for someone. 2 minutes later, a taxi pulled up. The younger man got in, and the taxi drove away, heading south. The photographer continued working alone, methodically documenting the beach and surrounding area. Danny divided his attention between the swimmers and the photographer, a difficult balancing act that left him feeling stressed and distracted. A mother approached his chair and asked about jellyfish warnings. Danny answered her questions while keeping the photographer in his peripheral vision. The woman thanked him and returned to her children. The photographer worked for another 20 minutes, then walked to Collins Avenue and got into the same white Chevrolet Danny had seen on Sunday. The car pulled away, heading south toward downtown Miami Beach. Danny noted the time, 11:53. He scanned the beach for any FBI presence but saw nothing obvious. Either they were watching from hidden positions or they hadn't arrived in time. 10 minutes later, Agent Chen appeared, walking casually along the beach like a tourist. He wore shorts and a Hawaiian shirt, completely different from the suit he had worn on Sunday. He approached Danny's chair and said quietly, "Did you see where they went?" Danny described what he had observed. Chen said, "The younger man is a new face. We did not have him on our radar. Did you hear anything they said?" Danny said no, they were too far away. Chen nodded and said, "We have teams following the primary subject now. We appreciate your vigilance. Keep watching and call if he returns." Danny said, "How long has this been going on?" "How many of them are there?" Chen said, "I cannot discuss operational details, but you should know your actions are making a difference. Miami is a strategic location. These people are gathering intelligence on our coastal defenses, our infrastructure, our military installations. Every piece of information you provide helps us protect national security." Danny said, "What are they planning?" Chen said, "We do not know yet. Possibly sabotage, possibly just reconnaissance for future operations. The Soviet Union has extensive espionage networks throughout the United States. South Florida is particularly important because of our proximity to Cuba and our military bases." Danny felt a chill despite the heat. He said, "Are we in danger?" Chen said, "The FBI monitors these threats continuously. As long as we identify and track hostile agents, we can neutralize them before they act. Your cooperation is essential to that effort." He tipped an imaginary hat and walked away, blending into the beach crowd. Danny watched him disappear, then returned his attention to the ocean, where a group of teenagers were swimming farther out than they should. He blew his whistle and waved them closer to shore. They complied reluctantly. The afternoon passed without incident. Thunderstorms rolled in at 3 o'clock, driving everyone off the beach. Danny sat in his chair, rain soaking through his shirt, watching the empty sand and churning surf. The photographer didn't return. Tuesday through Thursday passed in similar fashion. Danny maintained his vigilance, scanning every person on the beach, but the photographer didn't appear. By Thursday afternoon, Danny wondered if the FBI surveillance had scared the man away or if he had completed whatever mission brought him to Miami Beach. Danny began to relax slightly, thinking perhaps the crisis had passed. Friday morning proved him wrong. The photographer returned at 9:45, earlier than his previous visits. Danny was eating breakfast, a ham and cheese sandwich he had brought from home, when he spotted the familiar figure walking north along the beach. Danny immediately called the FBI number. The same woman answered. Danny said, "He is back north end of my section," she said. "Agents are deploying now. Maintain observation." This time the photographer brought professional surveying equipment, a tripod, what looked like a theodolite or similar precision instrument, and several maps or charts. He set up his operation about 300 feet from Danny's position and began taking measurements, occasionally consulting the charts and making notes. This went beyond casual photography. This was detailed reconnaissance, the kind of work someone would do if they were planning construction or military operations. Danny watched through binoculars, memorizing every action. The photographer worked with practiced efficiency, suggesting significant training and experience. After 30 minutes, a third individual approached the photographer. This man was older, perhaps 60, with white hair and a thin build. He wore a guayabera shirt and carried a briefcase. The two men spoke briefly, the photographer showing him the charts and pointing at various landmarks. The older man nodded, made notes in a small book, then handed the photographer an envelope. The photographer opened the envelope, glanced inside, and tucked it into his camera bag. The older man walked away, heading south. Danny's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the binoculars. He had just witnessed what appeared to be an exchange of materials and possibly money. This was actual espionage, not just suspicious photography. He maintained his observation, noting that the older man walked to Collins Avenue, where a black Lincoln sedan waited. The man got in the passenger side, and the car drove away heading north. Danny memorized the license plate number, Florida BX4729. The photographer continued his surveying work for another hour, then packed his equipment and left in the white Chevrolet. Danny immediately called the FBI and provided detailed descriptions of everything he had observed, including the license plate number. Agent Carmichael arrived 30 minutes later, this time wearing casual clothes and sunglasses. He sat on the sand near Danny's chair, pretending to sunbathe while they talked quietly. Carmichael said, "Excellent work. The older individual you described is someone we have been tracking for months. He operates as a handler for several Soviet agents in South Florida. The license plate you provided helps us establish surveillance patterns. Danny said, "What happens now?" Carmichael said, "We continue building our case. We need to identify everyone in this network before we make arrests. If we move too soon, we only catch a few people and the rest scatter." Danny said, "How long will that take?" Carmichael said, "Could be weeks, could be months. Intelligence work requires patience. In the meantime, keep doing exactly what you have been doing. You are our eyes on this beach." Danny said, "Is there any danger to the public? Should people be warned?" Carmichael said, "We assess the risk as low currently. These individuals are gathering intelligence, not preparing imminent attacks. However, the information they are collecting could be used for future operations, which is why stopping them is critical. We have the beach under surveillance now. If anything threatens public safety, we will intervene immediately." Danny felt reassured but also burdened by the weight of the secret he carried. He couldn't tell his family, his friends, his fellow lifeguards. He had to maintain his normal routine while simultaneously serving as an intelligence asset for the FBI. The dual role exhausted him. The following week brought a new development. On Wednesday, August 28th, Danny arrived for his afternoon shift and found Agent Chen waiting near the lifeguard stand. Chen said, "We need your help with something specific. Tomorrow morning, we believe the primary subject will return to conduct final reconnaissance. We are planning to arrest him and several associates. We need you to help identify him positively before we move in." Danny said, "Of course, whatever you need." Chen said, "We will have plainclothes agents on the beach. When you see him arrive, call the number and say the package has arrived. That is the signal for us to initiate the arrest. Do not do anything else, just make the call and stay in your chair. Let us handle the rest." Danny said, "Will there be any danger?" Chen said, "We anticipate cooperation. These are intelligence officers, not soldiers. They prefer to avoid confrontation. However, stay in your chair and away from the action just in case." Thursday morning, August 29th, 1963. Danny arrived at his post at 8 o'clock, 2 hours before his shift officially started. He wanted to be in position early, ready for whatever came. The beach was nearly empty, a few joggers, a man walking his dog. The ocean calm and blue under a cloudless sky. Danny felt his heart pounding as he scanned the sand, watching for the photographer. At 9:37, the familiar figure appeared, walking south along the beach. Danny grabbed the phone and called the FBI number. When the woman answered, he said, "The package has arrived." She said, "Received. Thank you." Danny hung up and watched. The photographer set up his equipment in the usual spot, approximately 200 feet north of Danny's position. He began photographing the coastline, working with the same methodical precision Danny had observed before. For 15 minutes, nothing happened. Danny wondered if something had gone wrong, if the FBI had changed their plans. Then he noticed people converging on the photographer from multiple directions. They looked like ordinary beachgoers, a couple walking hand in hand, a jogger, a man carrying a fishing rod, but they all moved with purpose, closing the distance in a coordinated pattern. When they were within 20 feet, the agents revealed themselves. "FBI, hands where we can see them." The photographer froze, his camera still raised to his eye. He slowly lowered it and raised his hands. 2 agents moved in quickly, securing his arms behind his back. Another agent retrieved the camera and equipment. A 4th agent spoke to the photographer in what sounded like Russian. The photographer responded in the same language, his voice calm despite the situation. The entire arrest took less than 2 minutes. The agents led the photographer toward Collins Avenue, where several unmarked cars waited. Danny watched the scene unfold, feeling relief mixed with anticlimax. After 2 weeks of tension and vigilance, it ended so quickly, so quietly. Most people on the beach hadn't even noticed. Life continued normally around them, unaware that a Soviet spy had just been apprehended. Agent Carmichael approached Danny's chair 30 minutes later. He climbed up and sat on the platform next to Danny, looking out at the ocean. Carmichael said, "Well done. Your observations helped us build a solid case against this individual and several associates. We arrested 4 people this morning at different locations across Miami. They were part of a Soviet intelligence network that has been operating here for over 2 years. Danny said, "What were they planning?" Carmichael said, "We are still analyzing the materials we seized, but it appears they were conducting detailed reconnaissance of our coastal defenses, naval facilities, and infrastructure. The photographs and measurements they collected could be used to plan sabotage operations or to coordinate amphibious landings in case of war." Danny felt sick. He said, "They were planning to invade Miami Beach?" Carmichael said, "Not immediately, but militaries plan for every contingency. The Soviet Union has detailed intelligence on strategic locations throughout the United States. We do the same regarding their territory. This is the reality of the Cold War." Danny said, "What happens to them now?" Carmichael said, "They will be charged with espionage. Some may be deported as part of a prisoner exchange. Some may face trial. The legal process will take time. What matters is that we disrupted their network and prevented whatever operations they were planning." Carmichael stood and shook Danny's hand. He said, "The FBI is grateful for your service. Your vigilance and courage made a real difference. Not many citizens would have noticed what you noticed, and fewer would have taken action." "You should be proud," Danny said. "I just did what felt right." Carmichael smiled and said, "Exactly. That is what makes the difference between us and them. We have citizens who care enough to protect their communities." He climbed down from the chair and walked away. Danny sat in his chair for a long time, processing everything that had happened. 2 weeks ago, he had been a simple lifeguard, worrying about riptides and sunburn. Now he was part of an FBI operation that had dismantled a Soviet espionage network. The experience had changed him. He looked at the beach differently now, seeing not just vacationers and waves, but potential threats lurking beneath the surface of ordinary life. The Cold War wasn't just something that happened in distant places like Berlin or Moscow. It was here, in his neighborhood, on his beach, hiding in plain sight among the tourists and sunshine. In the weeks that followed, life returned to normal on the surface. Danny continued his lifeguard duties, watching swimmers and enforcing beach rules. But he remained vigilant, scanning crowds for suspicious individuals, noting unusual behavior. The FBI had told him the network was dismantled, but Danny knew there were likely others. The Soviet Union wouldn't abandon Miami Beach as an intelligence target simply because one network failed. There would be others, different faces, different methods, but the same mission: gathering information, preparing for conflict, exploiting America's openness against itself. One afternoon in September, Danny received a letter at his apartment. It had no return address, only a Washington, D.C. postmark. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the FBI seal at the top. It read, "Dear Mr. Prescott, on behalf of the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States government, we extend our sincere gratitude for your exceptional service to national security. Your vigilance and cooperation directly contributed to the successful disruption of a hostile intelligence operation. While the nature of this matter prevents public recognition, please know that your actions exemplified the finest traditions of American citizenship. The information and assistance you provided were instrumental in protecting our nation and its people. Thank you for your service." The letter was signed by J. Edgar Hoover himself. Danny folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He would never show it to anyone, never speak about what had happened, except in vague terms if asked. The FBI had requested his discretion, explaining that public disclosure could compromise other operations or endanger personnel. Danny understood and agreed. Some acts of service didn't require recognition or reward. Knowing he had made a difference was enough. Years later, after the Cold War ended and documents were declassified, historians would piece together the full scope of Soviet intelligence operations in South Florida during the 1960s. They would discover that Miami Beach had been a priority target for Soviet reconnaissance, with multiple networks operating simultaneously. One of those networks, broken up in August 1963, had been gathering intelligence for a planned sabotage campaign targeting coastal radar installations and communication facilities. The network had been identified and dismantled thanks to the observations of a vigilant lifeguard who noticed what others missed. But those revelations came decades later. In the summer of 1963, Danny Prescott simply returned to his chair, watching the waves, protecting swimmers, and keeping his secrets. The photographer, whose real name was never publicly disclosed, was deported to the Soviet Union in 1964 as part of a spy exchange. The 3 other individuals arrested that August morning received similar treatment. None faced public trial. The FBI preferred to handle such matters quietly, avoiding the publicity that might reveal American counterintelligence methods or create diplomatic incidents. The white Chevrolet and the black Lincoln were traced to a rental company in downtown Miami. The paperwork was fraudulent, the addresses fake. The equipment seized from the photographer included not only cameras and surveying tools, but also coded messages, microdots containing classified information, and payment records showing substantial funds flowing from Soviet intelligence services. Analysis of the photographs revealed detailed documentation of over 40 sensitive locations along the South Florida coast, including radar stations, Coast Guard facilities, naval installations, and communication towers. The surveying measurements were precise enough to plan military operations. American counterintelligence officers were stunned by the scope and sophistication of the operation. This wasn't amateur hour. The individuals involved were trained professionals conducting systematic reconnaissance as preparation for potential military action. Whether that action was sabotage, invasion support, or intelligence gathering for future planning remained unclear. What was clear was that South Florida represented a strategic priority for Soviet intelligence, and that priority hadn't diminished despite the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis 10 months earlier. If anything, Soviet interest had intensified, driven by the permanent presence of Castro's communist government 90 miles from the American mainland and the massive CIA Operation JM Wave that was conducting covert actions against Cuba from bases in Miami. The Cold War was a hall of mirrors where each side monitored the other, collecting information, planning operations, preparing for a war everyone hoped would never come. Miami Beach, with its tourists and nightclubs and beautiful weather, seemed an unlikely battlefield. But in the shadow war of espionage, everywhere was a battlefield. Every piece of information mattered. Every unguarded moment could be exploited. The Soviet photographer had understood this. So had the FBI agents who tracked him, and so had Danny Prescott, a lifeguard who paid attention. As autumn arrived and the summer tourist season faded, Danny reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. He had joined the Navy to serve his country, never expecting that his most significant contribution would come after his discharge, while sitting in a lifeguard chair on Miami Beach. Life surprised you that way. Heroism wasn't always dramatic or obvious. Sometimes it was just noticing what others missed and having the courage to act on that observation. Danny had done both, and in doing so, he had helped protect countless lives and prevent operations that might have escalated tensions between superpowers already balanced on the edge of nuclear catastrophe. The story could have ended differently. If Danny had dismissed his instincts, if he had convinced himself the photographer was harmless, if he had failed to call the FBI, the Soviet network might have continued operating for months or years, collecting intelligence that could have been used in ways no one could predict. One person's vigilance had made the difference. That lesson stayed with Danny for the rest of his life. In a democracy, security wasn't just the government's responsibility. It belonged to every citizen who cared enough to pay attention, to question what seemed wrong, to take action when necessary. The Soviet Union and other authoritarian regimes relied on fear and control to maintain power. America relied on something different: engaged citizens who understood that freedom required constant defense. Danny Prescott continued working as a lifeguard for 3 more years before accepting a position with the Miami Beach Police Department, where he eventually became a detective specializing in fraud investigation. He never forgot that August in 1963, when his vigilance had mattered, when his observations had made a difference. He carried those lessons into his police work, training younger officers to trust their instincts, to pay attention to details, to never dismiss anomalies simply because they seemed insignificant. Some of the best police work, he told them, comes from noticing what doesn't fit and having the curiosity to investigate further. The broader historical context adds depth to Danny's story. The early 1960s were a period of extraordinary tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall had been constructed in 1961, physically dividing the city and symbolizing the ideological divide between East and West. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 had brought the superpowers to the brink of nuclear war, resolved only through tense negotiations that left both sides shaken and wary. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and President John F. Kennedy had stared into the abyss and stepped back, but the fundamental conflict remained. Each side continued seeking advantage through espionage, propaganda, and proxy conflicts. Miami's role in this struggle was significant but often overlooked. The city hosted the largest CIA station in the world outside of the agency's headquarters in Virginia. JM Wave, operating undercover as a naval research facility on the University of Miami's South Campus, employed hundreds of CIA officers and thousands of Cuban exiles in operations aimed at overthrowing Castro's government. These operations included sabotage, propaganda, guerrilla training, and intelligence gathering. The Soviet Union responded by deploying its own intelligence officers to monitor CIA activities, recruit agents, and gather information on American military capabilities. South Florida became a chessboard where both superpowers maneuvered for position. The Soviet photographer Danny observed was one piece in this larger game, a pawn perhaps, but pawns can be important. The intelligence he gathered might have seemed mundane, just photographs and measurements, but such data became invaluable when combined with information from other sources. A photograph of a radar installation, measurements of a bridge's load capacity, observations of traffic patterns. Individually, these details meant little. Collectively, they could enable military planning, sabotage operations, or strategic decision-making. This was why counterintelligence mattered. Preventing adversaries from collecting information was as important as collecting information about them. The FBI played a crucial role in this effort. While the CIA focused on foreign intelligence, the FBI handled counterintelligence within the United States. Working to identify and neutralize Soviet spies and networks, the Bureau maintained files on thousands of suspected agents, conducted surveillance operations, recruited double agents, and coordinated with local law enforcement. Success often depended on tips from observant citizens like Danny Prescott. The FBI couldn't be everywhere, couldn't watch everyone. They needed people willing to report suspicious activity, to trust their instincts, to cooperate with investigations. Most tips led nowhere, false alarms or misunderstandings. But occasionally, as in Danny's case, they uncovered genuine threats. After the arrests in August 1963, the FBI dismantled the Soviet network's infrastructure. Safe houses were raided. Dead drop locations were identified and monitored. Financial accounts were frozen. The network had been sophisticated, using classic espionage tradecraft, cover identities, coded communications, dead drops for exchanging materials, and a cell structure that limited each individual's knowledge of the broader operation. But the network had one fatal flaw. They underestimated the vigilance of ordinary Americans. They assumed they could operate openly, disguised as tourists or business people without attracting attention. Danny Prescott proved that assumption wrong. The psychological toll of serving as an intelligence asset affected Danny in ways he hadn't anticipated. For weeks after the arrests, he struggled with anxiety, constantly watching for threats, unable to relax even at home. He had nightmares about Soviet agents targeting him for revenge. He jumped at unexpected sounds. He questioned whether everyone around him might be a spy. The FBI provided no counseling or support. They thanked him, asked him to remain silent, and moved on to the next operation. Danny was left to process the experience alone, working through the stress and fear in private moments. Gradually, the acute anxiety faded, replaced by a permanent vigilance that never entirely disappeared. He had seen behind the curtain, understood that the world was more dangerous and complicated than most people realized. That knowledge changed him, but it also gave him purpose. Danny had always wanted to serve, to make a difference, to protect people. The Navy had provided one avenue for that service. Lifeguarding was another. And now counterintelligence, even in a small way, had become part of his contribution. He took pride in knowing he had helped his country, even though he could never discuss it publicly. That quiet pride sustained him through the difficult moments, the stress and fear and isolation. He had done something that mattered. That was enough. The Cold War would continue for another 28 years after that August day in 1963, winding through periods of détente and renewed tension before finally ending with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Throughout those decades, thousands of intelligence officers and ordinary citizens on both sides worked in shadows, gathering information, protecting secrets, conducting operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. Some became famous, like the Cambridge Five or Aldrich Ames. Most remained anonymous, their contributions known only to their handlers and perhaps a few family members sworn to secrecy. Danny Prescott fell into the latter category, one of countless Americans who served their country quietly, without recognition or reward, motivated simply by duty and love of country. As Danny sat in his lifeguard chair on that September afternoon, watching families play in the surf and couples walk along the beach, he felt a deep appreciation for the scene before him. This was what he had protected. Not abstract concepts like democracy or capitalism, but this: people enjoying freedom, safety, and peace. The right to relax on a beach without fear, the ability to live life without constant surveillance or threat, the promise that tomorrow would be safe enough to plan for. These things didn't happen by accident. They required constant vigilance, sacrifice, and the willingness of people to stand up when they saw something wrong. Danny had stood up, he had done his part. And Miami Beach remained safe, its secrets protected, its people unaware of how close danger had come. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.